Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room, an island show that likes to reach out on the World Wide Web and shake that information tree and see what comes tumbling out. I'm Robin At.her, and tumbling out of his Saanich lair is my co-host with the most, the Croatian sensation himself, John Jurisic. And John, Premier David Eby seems to have a problem.
Robin, we thought this wouldn't happen, that he would be skating into the election.
You kept saying this.
I know.
Saying this, yes.
I'm not wrong. You know, we now have a controversy that's landed right on his feet, and he better clean it up quickly, Robin, or the bad smell might bite him at the ballot box.
A former advanced education minister, Selina Robinson, who is Jewish, was talking to an all-Jewish panel and suggested during that conversation that the area of Palestine was a crappy piece of land. This was before Israel really became a nation, and I think did a lot of work in that area in terms of farming and economic development, but still probably not the best phrase for her to use as a minister of the crown. And for this ill-advised turn of phrase, she was rapidly fired from cabinet and told to take Islamophobia courses. So what happens in the end? She felt put upon. She walked across the floor, sits as an independent, and now says there is anti-Semitism within the ranks of the NDP. And David Eby is scratching around for a response. If he agrees to investigate, a special investigator, in some ways, then maybe he's suggesting that there could be a problem. If he ignores the accusation, again, he's inviting the continued anger of British Columbia's Jewish community and the many, many people out there who support them. So it's a problem on both sides of this issue.
Times they are rumbling and tumbling for the BC NDP. David Busch is a Victoria lawyer and federal conservative who's a big believer in the right to protest, but not the right to do so with racist language. He suggests pro-Palestinian protesters have been crossing the line, and the NDP needs to be careful not to align themselves too closely to protesters who shout out angry slogans like "Death to Jews," which was heard last weekend at a rally in Montreal.
I don't sit in on those caucus meetings on the political left. I really don't know what goes on in them. I will fully defer to Selina on that. She would be in a far better position than I to judge what's happening within the NDP ranks. They don't share their internal memos with me, unfortunately. I really don't know why. I'd be delighted if they did. I think, racism, though, whether it's, Islamophobia or anti-Semitism, it's a problem everywhere. And we need to be ready to stand up and call it out when we see it. You can disagree on issues. You can disagree on policy, but it shouldn't be because of somebody's religion, of their skin color, or anything of that regards. Let's keep it to, hey, here's a policy that we think we should implement. Is it good? Is it bad? Let's talk about it without getting personal. And that's something that needs to be worked on. And I'm seeing and hearing lots of examples coming forth in the media right now. And I'm just grateful that I wasn't on the receiving end of any of those. But we do need to stand up and stamp it out where and when we find it. And I think our Mr. Eby has a tough job ahead of him, because there certainly appears to be a lot of work in regards to the NDP, at least, that needs to get done.
David Busch has to be a very happy camper right now. We're over a year away from the federal election campaign, but there doesn't seem to be much of a shift in terms of the polling numbers. The Conservatives and Pierre Poilievre continue to ride very high in all of the various polls and surveys. According to a new survey by Abacus Research, only 15% of Canadians believe that Justin Trudeau and his Liberals deserve to be reelected at this point, and only 1 in 4 think that Canada is headed in the right direction. Let's take a look at that poll, the Abacus National Survey. If the election was held today, the Conservatives would win 42% of committed voters, and the Liberals at 24% of committed voters, NDP at 18%, and the Green Party with only 4% of committed voters. Still an undecided group, but that is shrinking all the time. A note that in Quebec, 34% of committed voters say they will vote for the Bloc Québécois, but that doesn't really matter on the national scene. So it's really an interesting situation, and David Busch, as I say, has to be very happy.
Grinning from ear to ear, isn't he? Points out that the major issues top of mind with Canadian voters are all strong for the federal Conservatives. In contrast, while the Trudeau Liberals get fairly high marks for the handling of Canada's support for Ukraine in its conflict with Russia, its support drops significantly on other key issues. Here's how the Liberals look on these files. According to the Abacus National Survey, Liberal housing strategy, 23% support. How are they dealing with the rising cost of living and affordability? 26% support. Managing government finances, 33% support. Crisis in healthcare, 35% support. Wouldn't want those kind of percentages in any kind of race that I'm involved with. And the national debates on hate crime, drugs, and homelessness are also big issues of contention. So while we're still a long way from an election, federal Conservatives are very optimistic that change is in the air, Robin.
We got to get the red tape out of the way. We got to get the gatekeepers out of the way and let the builders build. I think it's really ironic that when Trudeau announced a while back his housing accelerator fund and how this was going to speed up new housing starts dropped by 20%. Some people have the Midas touch. Other people, well, they have a very different touch. And everything seems to just plummet, much like his poll numbers.
Well, we'll be hearing a lot more from David Busch in the days and weeks ahead, but we're now going to shift to another person who is not really political. However, she has spent most of her adult life attempting to build bridges in the world of education, economic development, social development, and it's a real feather in our cap to have her in the Rumble Room.
Boy, is it ever. Karen Christie comes from a very famous family, as her great-great-grandfather, William Christie, arrived in Toronto from Scotland at the ripe young age of 19. And guess what? Eventually started the Christie Biscuit Company, those great cookies. He was the Mr. Christie that you hear about in all the cookie ads. The family sold the business in the 1920s, but that sense of adventure clearly carried on with Karen.
Absolutely. She was born in central Canada, but raised out in Calgary, Alberta. And she traveled widely when she was young. Long cycling trips across North America, all across Australia, Southeast Asia, you name it. In the 1970s, she got a teacher certificate, and French was her specialty. Teaching French was her specialty. Where does she go to teach French? She goes to the Yukon to teach French up in the Yukon territory at that time. But her ambitions proved to be much, much further afield. A volunteer teaching position came open in Ethiopia with an NGO. She took it. Opportunities to become an election monitor in the Balkans several times presented themselves, and she took them. Later, economic development stints with the federal government in dangerous locations like Afghanistan and Haiti, and even a turn as an election monitor on the West Bank when Hamas took control.
Karen Christie has taken on all of these challenges. She's written a book. She now joins us as a salute to International Women's Day. Let's zoom her in.
And now joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room for the very first time is author, educator, and retired diplomat, Karen Christie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Robin. It's a pleasure to be here.
And your book, An Intrepid Woman's Memoir. Well, no kidding, Karen. I recently finished up a holiday, well-deserved holiday in Mexico, and I had a chance to read your book cover to cover. And my goodness gracious, over 5 decades and six continents, so many things, so many stories. But I think we're going to start with something that's really topical, based on a stint that you had on the West Bank in Palestine, and it was during the time that the elections were underway in 2006, and Hamas was running for election, and that was against Yasser Arafat's group. And as it happened, Hamas won that election in a convincing fashion and are still in power today. So How did you feel about Hamas at the time? And how do you think most people in Palestine at that time felt about them?
Well, I suppose the election results are the indicator of how they felt at 44.5% of the vote, which is pretty strong. And I was there for 5 weeks as part of the Canadian International Development Agency, CEDA, then known as CEDA, now part of Global Affairs Canada. We were anxious that they would be peaceful, and they were. I think there was also I know there was a lot of surprise at the results. Nobody expected Hamas to win, at least not in our contacts with the people that we spoke with. What I feel could have happened, and it didn't, I think, because it wasn't expected that they would win. If Hamas had done what has happened in Ireland with the IRA creating Sinn Féin, the political wing, we would have a different picture. I don't know how different it would be today, but because as a result of Hamas winning, as it was, the terrorist organization that it was labeled as, many countries decided to stop their aid to the West Bank, which was not what the West Bank needed. So it was a surprise. I think it was welcomed by the Palestinians. As you say, it was an opportunity for them to go forward, they felt. And unfortunately, the international community hindered that to a certain extent by saying, well, we can't support you because of who you are.
I guess there wasn't a Good Friday Agreement situation, though, like when the IRA actually then buried their weapons, and then Sinn Féin, which remained their political wing, stayed in power. Now, actually, for the first time in Northern Irish history, Sinn Féin have the most powerful position in Northern Ireland. So things have changed that way. And just to follow up now on what we're seeing today in the region, and Hamas, of course, is in this terrible conflict with Israel. With your background and the things you've seen, and you've been there and seen the atmosphere, can you envision a way that this can possibly get solved? I mean, it's been going on for generations. It's been going on for, well, some would suggest it's been going on for centuries, but it's certainly been going on in a big way since the Second World War. It seems without any kind of real solution that's going to stick. Do you have thoughts on what could possibly work to solve this problem?
I think what I'd like to say is related to what I learned when I was there. So that was 18 years ago now. I could feel the angst, desperation of the Palestinians. And one way I could feel it, for me, what it seemed to be was psychological warfare on the part of Israel. And one example of that would be the checkpoints that citizens of West Bank were subjected to move from A to B. And it's kind of like, maybe it's how we feel, some of us might feel when we go through security at an airport. Sometimes we get annoyed and we choose to travel. But if you're a citizen and you want to go from A to B within your own territory, how does it feel? And the other question I have always asked myself, because being there in the West Bank, being on the streets, being at a stoplight in Jerusalem, and thinking, oh, what if that bus beside me blows up? What is it? What is wrong with the situation when a mother is proud of her son for being a suicide bomber? Something's got to be pretty darn wrong. And so I haven't answered your question. what could we do? Sometimes I want to go like this. I want to shake us all up, slap us around. I was a teacher for a while. Of course, I didn't use those tactics, but you just want to yell, stop.
Well, I'm going to bring us to another part of the world, one that I'm very familiar with, Karen. I've read the outline of your book, and it's amazing. Frankly, all of the jobs and places you've visited and worked as a teacher, as a political observer, in some capacities as a diplomat. Naturally, I'm particularly interested in your stints in the Balkans. You were where you were in Serbia, you were in Kosovo, Macedonia at various times. You stated several times in your book that you would always attempt to be a neutral party. I understand that. Obviously, how hard was that? My family have Croatian, roots. So I know a lot about the area and how difficult that would be for you. In your mind, how is this region currently doing in trying to heal itself from centuries-old conflict?
Yeah. I'd like to think that the impartiality that I arrived with was related to the fact that I was a fifth-generation Canadian of British ancestry. So no link, and I had done no traveling through that part of the world. So, and when the conflict was taking place in the early 90s, I found it so difficult that I tuned it out. And it was easier to tune things out in those days because we didn't have social media the way we have now. And our local staff would not have a job if they couldn't behave in an impartial manner. And of course, we were there to monitor that. Whether how successful we were is perhaps debatable. But to go closer to your question, John, about how is the region doing now, healing itself, that's not an easy question, especially for a foreigner who left there in 2002. And the next place I went was Kandahar 6 years later. And after a 4-year period working on Afghanistan, I went to Haiti. And when you move from place to place like that, you have to put the place you've left behind because you have a new context to learn. And I'm a generalist. And but I did look on the internet last night to see what was out there. Not that much that was current that I could find. I'm sure there's lots of anecdotes, but here's a very simplistic response. It's not in the news these days.
That's right.
Does that mean that it's functional? I don't know, John. Do you follow it closely?
Well, actually, yes, I do have some reflections on this topic. We were there last year, and of course, there are various communities in this city, and so I am aware of the. So here's the sort of general statement that's been my experience. These are simmering conflicts that erupt every once in a while. There are triggers. Tito's death in and around the early 90s or something, triggered a war. Then they simmer, and then something triggers, and off they go, indicating, in fact, that they're not getting along. And they just sort of, they're very polite or diplomatic with each other until they can't or aren't. And isn't that the case in so many of these hotspots or war zones in the world? Israel and the Gaza situation. I'm not saying they were living together peacefully, but there wasn't as much conflict as there is now. Then boom, something happens and off we go. And so is it human nature to never ever solve these things, Karen?
Well, and there's a nice big question for you. And I do think, Karen, though we haven't, as you said, seen a lot of conflict taking place there, at least not overtly. And I think just in itself, it makes it seem like it was really worthwhile sending our peacekeepers there and people like General Lewis Mackenzie. And there was a huge effort internationally to try to dampen down some of that hatred and tension. Doesn't mean it's all solved, but at least we're not hearing it on the front page, as you mentioned. And I just want to maybe shift again. We've only got so much time and there's so much area to cover. You're my second Karen. You're my second Karen that is a French teacher, a former French teacher who went and taught at a younger age in Ethiopia. How crazy is that? And this other Karen also lives in Victoria. So it must be a thing. But anyway, you were in Ethiopia, and you talk about that in your book and the vivid challenge of working in that environment and the work that Canada does and resources these projects around the world. And I just want to get into your feelings about, of course, Ethiopia. We can focus on that, but the whole thing of it just seems like we have these series of terrible problems that we hear about, and then we don't hear about them anymore. But that doesn't mean they're not still there. I remember the children from By.we, and they used to raise money for that, and then it was Bangladesh, and then we did hear a lot about Ethiopia, especially when their civil war really broke out in a big way. So you were part of Canada's outreach to Ethiopia at a time where things were tough, certainly sounded very tough in the part of the country you were working in. Is it money well spent? And do you think that Canada and other countries like Canada are making a real difference in these places that can be measured through the years after you leave?
I was there for 18 months from 87 to 88. So it was post-famine time, down 550 kilometers south of the capital city, in a part of Ethiopia that's not looked upon very favorably by Ethiopians in general, because it's down in the Rift Valley, so the altitude is lower, and a lot of Ethiopians are high altitude people. So I was Canada's first teacher down at that institute. It was a brand new institute. And actually, just for the record, I taught English there.
Right.
French in another part of the world, which we can touch on after if you want.
Well, my friend who she taught English in Ethiopia as well. But as it happened, she is also a French teacher.
A French teacher. How funny is that?
I know, it's a small world, isn't it? Yeah. And her name is Karen. So there you go.
Yeah, too funny. But as you know from reading my book, in 2003, I ended up as part of the government of Canada through the Canadian International Development Agency, CEDA at the time. And I was with them for 12 and a half years, and I know that Ethiopia became a country of focus. I can't tell you how discouraging it is, it's sad, that of the countries I've worked in fact, former Yugoslavia is one of the happier countries right now compared to Ethiopia, Afghanistan, and Haiti. I mean, really, what are we doing wrong? What? But on a more positive note, I'm a Pollyanna at heart, have an NGO heart, non-governmental organization heart, which I loved having as part of when I was a public federal servant. I thought that was great to be able to balance the two, or try to balance them. And I'm of the philosophy that, like the little boy who saw all the sea stars up on the beach, and he picked one up and threw it back into the water. And an older gentleman was there and said, well, what good's that going to do? And the little boy's answer was, well, it made a difference for that one sea star. And I think our presence in another place has an impact that in many ways we can't measure, both positive and negative. I mean, could relate a little story to you about Kandahar if you liked.
Well, we're going to move to Kandahar in just a second with John's next questions. That's a nice segue for us.
That is such a perfect segue.
Okay.
Did we share the questions with you? Of course we did not. Some time ago, in the not too distant past, you just indicated you served at a military base in Kandahar in Afghanistan. You also worked out of an office in Kabul. during your time in Afghanistan, millions of children, including millions of girls, received an education, some for the first time. Therefore, how hard is that to look at now in Afghanistan? What's going on there? How very depressing, at least that's what I think you're going to say.
There's many ways to look at it. There's the little girls that learned English, perhaps, or were able to go to school. There are the older girls as well who were able to complete secondary school, who were able to become teachers. My file, when I was a year in Kandahar and then 16 months in Kabul, was education. And you might say I had drunk the Kool-Aid, and I believe the statistics. In 2001, when the Taliban fell and the international community came in, there were approximately 700,000 children in school, none of them girls. When I left Kandahar in 2009, that there were 8 million children in school, and a third of them were girls.
Wow.
That's more than a 10-fold increase. And when I left again in 2012, after my time in Kabul, the number had gone up to 10 million. Again, with a third of them being girls. And something I want to say on the education front in terms of Afghanistan and where we are now, you've heard probably that when the Taliban came back, they closed the schools for girls.
Yes.
Yes and no. The schools remained open for girls up to grade 6 or age 12, which is considered puberty. So those girls still had access to education, apparently. Of course, we don't know, right? Exactly what they had access to. A woman I worked with in Kandahar, an Afghan American woman named Rangina Hamidi, after I left in 2012, she eventually became the Minister of Education in Kabul. And when we worked with her down in Kandahar, she was a cultural and language interpreter with us at the provincial reconstruction team where I was based. She points her finger at us, and fair enough, at us being the international community and the fact that we showed Afghan girls and women about opportunity, and then it fell.
Karen, I'm of the opinion that something is better than nothing. And the work that you and your team did and continue to do was extraordinary and gave so many women hope.
Well, and you've planted seeds, and you don't know where those seeds are going to spring or how they're going to spring. And the Taliban might be in for 10 years, or they might be in for 10 months. We don't know what the future is going to hold. But if there's that many educated women out there, it's almost, maybe it's under the surface, but maybe that's a resource that people can look forward to digging into. I want to move on before we let you go, Karen, into some lighter stuff, because the book certainly wasn't a heavy book. There were some very good accounts of some difficult regions, but there was a lot of very uplifting stuff where you start at your younger years, growing up in Calgary, I guess, and then your teaching stints where you were you went on a cycling trip down from Vancouver all the way to California because it gave you a cheaper ride to Australia. Not many people you hear about doing that. Riding a bicycle by yourself down to California, and then traveling all over Australia, and then going and riding around in Southeast Asia where you had some adventures, and most of them were good. A few of them were a little bit adventurous, I guess. You have already talked about your ability with language. You picked up a bit of Norwegian. You've picked up some Slavic ability. You have taught French in school, even though you grew up in Alberta. I mean, obviously, having language would be a real help in the kind of work that you chose to do, the kind of volunteer work and working for the government. So you've had this rich experience. As you look back now, and you've written the books, you've had a lot of chances to think about this. Is there anything, if you look at the book, you think, boy, I got everything done I wanted to get done? Or are there things that you wished you still could have accomplished? And are there things that you wished you could rewrite?
Sure. I wish I'd met the love of my life and had a family. There you go. Thank you for reminding me of that. And one friend of mine who read my book, she's 10, 11 years my senior, and she came back to me. She's Irish Canadian. She said, Karen, if you'd had a family and children, she said, you wouldn't have been able to do all of this. And I smiled. I said, yeah, probably true, Pauline. And I thought about it, and I thought, I think this is what she's saying she might have liked to have done if she hadn't had a family. And so I'm grateful for the opportunities that I've had. I'm also grateful for the fact that I was able to say yes to so many of the opportunities that came along because they were so unique. I mean, as I joke with people about being an election supervisor, administrator, when you're a little girl, nobody says to you, what would you like to be when you grow up? No, that didn't come up. And even, visiting Bosnia and Croatia. I mean, I love the Croatian coast. I'm so grateful for those opportunities and the fact that I had the freedom. I had the freedom.
Just fascinating. What a dynamic woman. I understand her book is available at Monroe's and other bookstores in town. Such a privilege, Robin, to have her in the Rumble Room.
Absolutely. And we want to thank her again. And on that note of thanks, thank our many, many viewers. We appreciate you watching the Rumble Room on all of our variety of platforms as we try to deliver things that we think are of interest to people both close and far away, right across the province, across the country. But we really hope that we are delivering information and great personalities that you enjoy. And now, John, would you explain how people can regularly follow us on the Rumble Room?
As usual, they can catch us on Facebook. They can catch us on X. All of our videos are on YouTube. We are also on audio podcast, so you can listen to us while you're running or biking. You can also join us on Instagram and TikTok, if that's where you hang around. So that's it. Once again, Puno Hvala, Karen Christie, for joining us today. That's Balkan for thank you. I'm John Jurisic. Very pleased to live in a community with such great and talented people as Karen, who are willing to share their stories.
And I love living in a great community of talented people like you, JJ. And I'm Robin At.her, happy to celebrate the rich fabric of our community and country as we rumble on.